Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Unit 7. This is our next to last unit, our penultimate unit for this online myth and culture class. I also wanted to let you guys know that this is the last, contrary to the syllabus, this is going to be the last unit that I'm going to require a paper from. You can still do the Unit 8 paper, which involves writing your own myth. It's a nice little sort of creative reading exercise, or creative writing exercise, but it will be purely extra credit. So if you do want to complete that, there will be a slot available on Blackboard to complete that, and that will help your overall grade. However, it is not necessary because I realize that we are getting very close to the end of the semester, and I want to make sure that we have time to do everything that we want to do. So, today we are going to be, in this video lecture, discussing sacred places, their connection to mythology, why certain places are sacred, why certain places are not sacred, and also how do we identify different types of sacred places. Beginning at the part of your book, of this chapter of your book, Leonard and McClure talk about the differences between places which are considered sacred versus places which are profane. And they talk about various ways in which various mythologists have attempted to identify what is sacred versus profane, and how do we create types of sacred places. An anthropologist named Andrew Gulliford, who was an expert in Native American mythology and archaeology, created 9 different types of sacred places. Sites associated with emergence and migration tales, sites of trails and pilgrimage routes, places essential to cultural survival, altars, vision quest sites, which I'll get into later, ceremonial dance sites, ancestral ruins, petroglyphs and pictographs, that is to say, drawings, writings, and designs on rock, and burial or massacre sites. Now, obviously, however, this does not cover the entire range of sacred places, but here are a few examples of Gulliford's types. For emergence and migration, one example is the Grand Canyon. The Zuni and Hopi and Navajo Indians, for example, all believed that as a people, at the creation of the universe, they first emerged out of the Grand Canyon and into the light of Father Sun, and that was their creation myth. That is how they emerged into the world. Altars we see in Christian churches, in mosques with a mihrab. We see an altar is essentially any place where offerings are left or sacrifices are made. We have pilgrimage routes, places of cultural survival. These are places without which a culture cannot continue. Vision quest sites, such as Bighorn Medicine Wheel depicted here, are sites where vision quests took place. These were Native American rites of passage. Hopefully you'll remember our discussion on rites of passage from Unit 6, in which an individual would travel to a vision quest site and would fast and pray until they had a vision of their spirit animal who would help guide them into adulthood. We're going to talk a little bit more about the belief systems associated with these vision quests in a bit. Ceremonial dance sites, burial and massacre sites such as graveyards, the sites of battle such as the Battle of Gettysburg, sites such as Ground Zero in New York City, the site of the 9/11 terror attacks, petroglyphs and pictographs, which I've already talked about, and ancestral ruins, places like the Colosseum, Stonehenge, stuff like that. In terms of the question, does this cover the, all different types of sacred places? There are sacred places that are not covered in this typology. For example, I'm sure that being from Bridgewater State, many of you are Red Sox fans. Red Sox fans, many of them consider Fenway Park to be a sacred place. But Fenway Park doesn't actually fit any of these particular types. So then what are some other ways then that mythologists and anthropologists can define sacred places? One such anthropologist by the name of Vine Deloria, his approach was to simplify it, to break it down to the scale of agency. Agency is an important anthropological and sociopolitical concept. It's essentially capacity of individuals to act independently and make their own choices. In anthropological and sociological theory, social structure limits those choices and the opportunities of the individual. So agency and social structure are always at odds with one another. For example, as a college professor to teach classes I have the agency to choose to teach an online class such as this one. I have the agency to show up to teach my class on campus wearing jeans and a t-shirt if I wish to, whereas other people in other businesses may not have the agency to do so. They're limited by social structure. They're limited by the rules. You know, I can show up to class in jeans and a t-shirt, but I can't run down Burrell Avenue stark naked. That would be a violation of social structure. So these are two important concepts that anthropologists, archaeologists, sociologists are constantly studying. And so this was a great concept around which Vine Deloria could organize his sacred places according to agency, specifically whether that agency was human or divine. He divided sacred places, therefore, into 4 categories. Places defined by human agency, that is to say, the capacity of human beings to act independently and make their own choices. These are places that are defined by human events, by human history. This would include sacred places such as the Statue of Liberty, the Colosseum, the Ground Zero in New York City, Fenway Park would be great examples of sacred places defined by human agency. Sacred places defined by divine agency, on the other hand, would be determined by their association with gods or some form of religion. This can be further divided into unseen or indirect divine agency and seen or direct divine agency. Examples of unseen or indirect divine agency, or places of unseen or indirect divine agency, would be churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, the Vatican in Rome, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Kaaba in Mecca. These would all be examples of places of unseen or indirect divine agency. These are places where people gather to worship and pray, but gods and divine beings were never actually physically there. It's not like on South Park where Jesus comes down to church every Sunday and says, "Hey, I was just popping in from heaven to see how you're doing." No, that's not the way it works. Whereas places with seen or direct divine agency are places where you actually had the presence of a divine being within a myth. So Mount Sinai, where God supposedly handed down the 10 Commandments to Moses, is a place of seen or direct divine agency. Mount Olympus in Greece, where the gods supposedly lived, where Zeus and Hera and Athena and so forth ruled, would be an example of seen or direct divine agency. The site of Jesus' crucifixion, the site of the Garden of Eden, heaven and hell themselves, would be places of seen or direct divine agency. Now, the last of these types is new sacred places, that is, places defined by personal agency. These are places which are not sacred to entire groups or cultures, but rather to individuals or small groups of individuals. Examples would be your home. Wouldn't you consider your own home to be a sacred place? Those roadside shrines that pop up at the site of an accident or a disaster are examples of new sacred places. The summer camp that you went to as a kid might be considered a place of personal agency, a sacred place of personal agency. So these are just some examples of these different types according to how Vine Deloria organized them. Another way in which sacred places was organized was according to Joseph Campbell, who we've already talked about in relationship to his theory of the monomyth, the idea of the journey of the hero. And what Joseph Campbell felt is that he felt that it's best to take a functionalist approach to sacred places. That is, develop what he referred to as meaning functions. That is, the functions of myths and the sacred places associated with them in relation to their meanings. So what did he mean by that? Well, for example, he felt that where there is a sacred place that connects you to the unknowable, that connects you to the divine, that connects you to the holy or the spiritual, that's a place with a transcendent function. Whereas a sacred place that's associated with a creation myth, a sacred place that explains the world around us, such as the Grand Canyon in Zuni mythology, or the Garden of Eden in Judeo-Christian mythology, or Tamawanshan, the place of creation in Aztec mythology. These are places that serve a cosmological function, that explain the world around us and how it came to be. Then there are sacred places that serve sociological and psychological functions. And the sociological function, it's the role which myth plays in describing and justifying the structures or the rules of a society. This is especially true of a myth that is one of the 5 that you may choose to read for your paper. It's a Chinese myth called the 10,000 Treasure Mountain, which describes a young man named Ko Li, who is rewarded with great treasures because he reflects all of the great values of Chinese society. He's respectful of his elders, he's generous, he's honest, he's humble, he's hardworking. Because he exhibits these qualities, he is rewarded, whereas the evil king, who is greedy, lazy, and violent, is punished. We call these sort of myths, these sociological function myths, we also call them screening myths, because they're meant to screen out bad behavior. Examples of this within American folklore might be, say, the myth of Santa Claus. You know, if you're good, you're going to get presents for Christmas. If you're bad, you're going to get coal in your stocking. So that would be an example of a screening myth within American folklore. Then we have Joseph Campbell's psychological function, the role which myth plays in establishing the individual psyche, the individual personality within the framework of a culture. You know, one of the places that I visited when I visited Paris back in when I was young, was Père Lachaise Cemetery. And a lot of famous people are buried there, Jim Morrison, etc., Oscar Wilde. And while I was there, I saw this woman who was in front of the grave of Frédéric Chopin, and she was cradling a violin, and she was just bawling her eyes out. This was a place that had a profound emotional effect on her. Whereas me, who I could care less about classical music, may have felt nothing. So we can see the idea of places that serve this kind of psychological function that can change the way we think, the way we behave, our emotions, the way that we feel. Joseph Campbell called these sacred places sites of longing and fear. Think, for example, about how you feel when you're in a church versus outside the church. Think about how you feel at a place such as a graveyard or Ground Zero in New York City, how that affects your mood and how you behave. So if we consider these meaning functions of certain myths, we can explore a number of interesting questions, like what's the significance of these myths, myths surrounding these places for the cultures that believed in them? To what degree are people and place connected, and what kinds of power do these myths exert on those who study them? Now, I talked a little bit about how sacred places can affect our mood and how we behave and future behaviors, what he calls the sites of longing and fear. And I gave the examples, for example, how you might feel at Ground Zero in New York City. However, these feelings of sociological and psychological connectedness, these meaning functions that Joseph Campbell talks about, are even stronger for both ancient and modern practitioners of animism. So, what exactly is animism? Animism is the belief that souls, spirits, gods, divinities, that they exist not only in humans, but in sacred places and other natural phenomena and aspects of the natural environment, like animals, plants, rocks, thunder, the wind, mountains, rivers, etc. Animism sounds strange to modern American beliefs, but animism is actually a very profound and very common belief system in world religion. It's found in a number of indigenous world religions, including ancient Roman religion, certain Native American religions, African and Australian Aboriginal belief systems, and most prevalently, the belief system of Shinto in Japan. So all of these belief systems involve these spirits that exist as elements of the natural world or a natural phenomena. These spirit souls are called daimoni by the Greeks. They were called numeni by the Romans, orishas by the Yoruba in Africa. Japan referred to them as kami. If this sounds at all familiar to you, it's actually related to the history of Japan and World War II specifically, because way back in the 13th century, Japan was going to be invaded by a Mongol fleet from China, when all of a sudden a typhoon came out of nowhere and wiped out the Mongol fleet. The prevailing belief in Japan was that they had been saved by a kami, by a spirit of the wind, or as it's called in Japanese, kame kazi. So not surprisingly, when they were looking to defend themselves from another foreign invader, that is to say the U.S. during World War II, the Japanese army developed this system of suicide pilots and referred to them by this name, by kamikaze. So that is also tied up to the idea of the Shinto belief system in Japan. Now, it's also important that we distinguish animism from a related belief system called totemism. Totemism is the belief that you can have a kinship relationship or a spiritual, mystical relationship with one of these spirit beings that exist in animism, such as an animal or a plant. This entity or totem is thought to interact with a given kin group or individual, serve as their emblem or symbol. Do you remember earlier in this PowerPoint when I was talking about vision quests, where a Native American, particularly in the Plains Indians, would go on this rite of passage where they would travel to a vision quest site and they would fast and pray for days on end until they had a vision of their spirit animal who would help guide them into adulthood. This is an example of totemism in action. So Leonard and McClure, in their book, decided to take this idea of creating different types of sacred places and simplify it even further, and just arrange it along the lines of what sacred places are physically. Are they sacred waters like the Jordan River, the Ganges River, Lake Titicaca? Are they sacred landforms like mountains, canyons, caves, places like Mount Fuji to the Egyptian Shinto religion, Mount Olympus to the ancient Greeks, the Grand Canyon to the Zuni Indians, etc.? Trees, gardens, or forests. Yggdrasil, the world tree in Norse or Viking mythology, the Bodhi tree in Buddhist mythology, the Garden of Eden in Judeo-Christian and Islamic mythology, etc. And then Blessed Isles or sacred realms, places like heaven, hell, Valhalla, Niflheim, etc. So, for your Unit 7 paper, which I would like to say again is the last paper that I'm going to require from you this semester, you can still complete the Unit 8 paper, but it will be accepted as extra credit to boost the test grade of your choice, be it midterm or final exam. The first of these myths is the Zuni and the Grand Canyon from the Zuni people of Arizona and New Mexico. Okay, so the first of these myths is the Zuni and the Grand Canyon, which is from pages 331 to 333 of your book. It explains the sacredness of the Grand Canyon to the Zuni people. As you go through, I want you to answer 3 specific questions. Number 1, what are the types of sacred places that are in this story? That includes not just Leonard and McClure's, but those from Gulliford, from Deloria, from Joseph Campbell. What is the significance of this sacred place to the Zuni Indians? And number 3, what does this myth tell us about the morals and values of the Zuni? So, for example, we already know one of these. We know that the Grand Canyon is a place of emergence and migration for the Zuni Indians, that it was a place where, at the creation of the universe, they first emerged out of the world and into the Grand Canyon, into the light of Sunfather. So, we have at least one of these down, so keep an eye out for others, such as trails and pilgrimage routes, burial or massacre sites, places of direct divine agency, and also keep out a lookout for examples of the belief systems of animism and totemism. For example, in one portion of the myth, it says, quote, Zunis do not make the same distinctions concerning living and non-living that many non-Indians make. To Zunis, the earth is alive, the walls of the Grand Canyon, the rocks, the minerals, the pigments there, and the water that flows between the walls of the canyon are all alive. So obviously that indicates a animistic belief system. The next myth that you can use is Bighorn Medicine Wheel. This is a Vision Quest site located on the border between southern Montana and northern Wyoming. Again, I want you to look at these three questions. Number one, what are the different types of sacred places, according to Gulliford, Deloria, Campbell, and Leonard McClure, that this could be? Vision Quest site is obviously one of those. What is the significance of this sacred place to the Northern Cheyenne, the Northern Arapaho, the Crow Indians, and the other Plains Indians tribes that find the site sacred? And what are the morals and values that are exhibited by this? In particular, this is not so much a myth, but a description of the sacred site, particularly the conflict that occurs between its Native American sacred function and its role as a tourist site and an archaeological site. For example, the U.S. Forest Service wanted to give basically the entire area away to timber and grazing interests and create a giant metal observation platform for the medicine wheel and open up these areas nearby to snowmobile trails. This is a site that Native Americans would go to pray and fast for days on end to find their spirit animal. So hearing snowmobiles go throughout the entire region was not what they wanted. Also, doing so would have been, at least partially, in violation of law, particularly NAGPRA. NAGPRA, or the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act, requires federal agencies and institutions that receive federal funding to return Native American cultural items to their descendants and tribes and Native American organizations. And this includes both artifacts and sites of cultural patrimony and sacredness, such as Bighorn Medicine Wheel. The next myth or story that you guys can choose is the medicine wheel. This is a description more of the sociological and psychological function of the medicine wheel. How does it affect a person's personality or psyche? And this ties more directly into that idea from Joseph Campbell of meaning functions and the sociological and psychological function. The next one is actually a series of 3 very short myths about Mount Fuji from Japan. These include a small one called Sacred Landforms in Japan, a poem called The Mountain of the Lotus and the Fan, and a story called Yosoji and the Goddess Fuji. Because these are wrapped up in Shinto belief systems from Japan, you'll want to, again, see how they incorporate elements of animism, most definitely, but also elements of all these different types as well. For example, because Mount Fuji is a symbol of the nation of Japan, it serves Joseph Campbell's sociological function. But because it is the site of a kami or deity or the goddess of Mount Fuji, it's also a place of direct divine agency and is associated with animism as well. So you'll want to look at both of those in these 3 small stories. And then finally, there's the story that I mentioned before, which is the 10,000 Treasure Mountain from southern China. This one deals with the boy Koli, and is an example of the sociological function of myth according to Joseph Campbell. This myth is specifically designed to teach the rules and structures and the values of Chinese society, such as filial piety or respect for one's elders and ancestors, humility, hard work, honesty, generosity, etc. Because Koli exhibits these qualities, he is rewarded. Because the evil king in the story is the opposite. He's violent, greedy, and lazy. Because the king in the story is the opposite of these things, he's punished. And in this way, it serves, again, as this sort of screening myth with a sociological function. So for any of these issues, again, I want you to focus on answering these 3 questions. Number 1, using multiple typologies of sacred place from this video lecture and from your book. Identify what type of sacred place is described in this myth. Number 2, what significance or importance did this sacred place hold for those who believed in this myth? And number 3, does this myth display the morals and values of this culture? And if so, what are those values? I know it says pick one myth from Unit 4 here. That is a typo right over here where it says Unit 4. Please ignore that. This is from Unit 7. From Chapter 6 of your book. This is the final chapter in your book. And again, this is the final essay I'm going to ask you guys to write. This will give you guys a little bit of extra time to not only complete the Unit 8 paper of writing your own myth for extra credit if you want, but also will give you the chance to complete any rewrites that you guys want to do of previous papers as well. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, you can contact me via email at any time, and also post on the discussion boards at Blackboard, on Blackboard as well. And again, I'm available anytime. Just post and I will answer as soon as humanly possible. So thank you very much, and I will see you guys again for Unit 8. Bye-bye.